Hi, my name is Aaron Sampson. These days, computer data is generated at a rate that we can barely comprehend. Much of that information is immensely useful and readily available to anyone, but there is a large contingent of that information that is and should remain confidential. In this course, I'll explore the CIA Triad, beginning with the principle of least privilege and concerns surrounding confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Then I'll introduce methods for protecting information, including antivirus and anti-malware applications, firewalls, password security, and safe browsing. Finally, I'll cover the importance of patching and updates, best practices for device security, and removing unwanted software. Upon completion, you'll have built the foundation for the basics of IT. This course helps to prepare learners for the CompTIA IT Fundamentals or ITF Plus certification exam, FC0U61. In this presentation, we'll provide an overview of the CIA Triad, which is a model designed to assist with creating policies and working with data securely within an organization. Now, the letters of CIA in this context don't have anything to do with the Central Intelligence Agency. Rather, they stand for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So, in some cases, you might hear this model referenced as the AIC Triad just to avoid confusion, but no matter how it's referenced, each element of the triad represents a critical component of data security. As for each element and the role it plays, confidentiality refers to the implementation of policies and procedures to ensure that access to certain information is limited to only those who are authorized. Integrity refers to the validity of the data, and availability ensures that the data can be reliably accessed and used when it's needed. Taking a closer look at each element, confidentiality and its primary function of limited access provides a means to keep data private so that only the appropriate entities are able to access it, which means implementing controls such as file and folder permissions and limited sharing, which primarily ensures proper levels of access within an organization. For example, users in the HR department would be able to view personnel records of the employees of the organization, which would likely contain personal and confidential information such as banking information needed for payroll deposits. But anyone outside of the HR department should not be able to view that information. But no method of implementing security is 100% effective, so skilled users and even outside attackers might still be able to gain access. So encryption can be applied as an additional layer of security so that even if an unauthorized user does gain access, the contents are further protected by the encryption, rendering the data unreadable without the appropriate decryption keys. Integrity not only refers to the validity and accuracy of the data, but also that it originated from a trustworthy source, and that even if it was originally trustworthy, that it has not been altered or corrupted since it was created. Now, there are a number of ways by which you can help to ensure data integrity, including implementing the two methods mentioned just a moment ago, permissions and encryption. Simply by ensuring the proper access to data, you can help to reduce integrity issues, but again, nothing is ever 100% effective. And data integrity can often be targeted by malicious users intent on causing damage to an organization. For example, an unsatisfied customer might try to alter your website to insert damaging information or anything that might tarnish the reputation of the organization. So additional measures such as digital certificates and digital signatures can be used. Certificates implement encryption as well, but are largely intended to ensure that the data that is being presented is in fact trustworthy and has not been altered. So let's turn things around a bit and consider a situation where the malicious user is not trying to attack the organization, but rather the general public by posing as the legitimate entity. For example, when you go to your online banking site, you want to know that it is the legitimate site and not some hacked version of it. I would guess that it's likely that most of you have received some kind of email at one point or another from a supposed financial institution claiming that there has been unusual or suspicious activity on your account, and they need you to sign in to verify your information. They then provide you with a link to a site which might look exactly like the real site, but of course it's just designed to capture your username and password. But the giveaway would be the digital certificate. Regardless of how authentic it looks, browsers always display the digital certificate of any site that has one, and it contains the information that verifies that it was issued to the legitimate organization. Digital signatures are used with email so that any message sent with the signature included can be verified that it did in fact come from the original sender, and only the intended recipient or recipients would be able to view the message. This can help to prevent someone from within the organization from sending a damaging message posing as someone else. But even if data confidentiality and integrity is maintained, that data isn't going to be of much use if it isn't available upon request. So availability measures need to be in place to ensure that all servers and other network components remain functional. And this is another significant concern with respect to external attacks, specifically what is known as the denial of service attack, which is simply designed to take down a service that does provide data availability, and/or a ransomware attack, whereby data is quite literally stolen or at least blocked by encryption until the organization pays a ransom for its return. And even in more day-to-day areas of concern, issues such as power losses, equipment failure, and unintentional human error can all result in the loss of access to data, at least temporarily. So, measures such as hardware and service redundancy can be implemented to ensure that if something does go down, such as a server, there is an alternate server available to continue providing that service. And regular data backups that are stored separately from the original can ensure that any lost data can be recovered. And updates to your devices can help to ensure that any vulnerabilities in the software are patched. Now, with respect to using the CIA Triad, there is no specific set of rules nor any step-by-step process. Rather, it's meant to be used to guide the security principles of your organization to help ensure that you apply various rules to the different types of data you have, then to periodically and regularly review your implementation to ensure that you've checked all the boxes, so to speak. In other words, have you addressed all three components of confidentiality, integrity, and availability? If so, then you should still look for possible areas of improvement, and if not, you should immediately direct your attention to any area that is lacking. So again, specific methods and implementation will vary, but by using the CIA Triad as a guideline or a template, you can help to ensure that your data will remain secure and intact. In this video, we'll outline the principle of least privilege, which is an approach to defining access to the various components of a system. But this approach requires that the level of access provided be as minimal as possible so that it meets the requirements of the job, but nothing beyond that. For example, an employee of the Human Resources Department might be able to view the payroll information of other employees, but they should not be able to alter that information. Perhaps only the department manager should be able to do so. Or a help desk user should be able to reset a user's password, but they should not be able to delete that user account or create new ones. Perhaps only the network administrator can do so. In short, it means that there are certain things that you need to be able to do to perform your duties, but you shouldn't be able to do everything. So, by properly implementing the principle of least privilege throughout your organization, you can help to protect the processes you have in place, the systems in use, and the applications and data being used. And I should point out here that there is often an assumption that the principle of least privilege only applies to things like data permissions. For instance, if we go back to the user in the HR department, the ability to view information but not alter it might simply be a matter of file permissions. Even the help desk user who can change a password but not create or delete a user is also a matter of permissions, but more accurately, it's what's referred to as user rights. But it's still a matter of the user being allowed to have the appropriate rights to perform those tasks. But it's not all limited to just data and permissions. For example, with respect to protecting systems, perhaps only the highest level network administrators might be allowed to even enter the server room to perform physical maintenance. And with respect to processes, perhaps only a branch manager has the authority to request new hardware from head office. Really, the principle can apply to just about anything where some kind of authorization is required. Or to put that another way, the principle should be applied to anything that should not be available to just anyone. So, of course, there are several advantages to using the principle of least privilege, perhaps most notably an increased level of security. But it also helps to ensure that your organization remains in compliance with any internal policies and procedures that are in place, as well as with any governmental or legal regulations that might apply to your operations. It can also decrease the potential of malware to cause damage because if a system owned by an administrator is compromised, then all processes and applications on that system might also be running with administrative privileges. So the malware can co-opt those processes to gain higher levels of access to the environment. But if most users are operating with lower levels of access, then any malware on those systems will be more limited in terms of what they can do. Organizations can also realize higher levels of productivity because less time can be spent troubleshooting, because users with lower privilege levels are less likely to affect even their own devices, such as by installing software or drivers that could result in instability or even device failure. So, some best practices with respect to the principle of least privilege then include making it a default policy throughout your organization, as opposed to only a guideline or something that is only applied under certain circumstances. And while this might seem like something that's rather obvious to state, you might be surprised at how often it is inadequately applied. And while there will always be a need for unrestricted accounts, there should be as few of them as possible, and they should not be used on a regular basis. For example, even the highest level network administrator should have a standard user account like everyone else for general day-to-day tasks, such as sending email and browsing the internet. The most privileged accounts should only be used when necessary, and even in those situations, for as little time as possible. All systems and devices in your organization should be hardened as much as possible, which refers to the process of disabling unnecessary services or components, any one of which could represent a possible point of access to an intruder or malware. And you should routinely revisit your security implementation to ensure that your configurations aren't becoming out of date, and be on the lookout for privilege creep, which is a process whereby a user may keep previously assigned privileges even though they have been reassigned or relocated to a different branch or job function and no longer need those previously assigned privileges. Again, there are many considerations with respect to how the principle of least privilege is applied, but by following these and other best practices, you can help to ensure that your organization remains as secure and as productive as possible. In this video, we'll examine some common concerns with respect to information privacy, along with some methods and approaches for mitigating those concerns. But adequately protecting information first requires an understanding of the types of threats, which can usually be categorized as unlawful access, such as data theft, malicious access, including snooping and eavesdropping, and unintentional errors, any or all of which could compromise the security of your environment and the information you're trying to protect. Adequately protecting information also requires the ability to recognize which information is most at risk, which will typically include anything that falls under the category of personally identifiable information, or PII, which basically boils down to anything that provides information about identity. For example, a person's passport, driver's license, or credit card information. Passwords are, of course, a prime target of attackers, health information, and biometric information, which can also be used to gain access to secure data or secure areas of your environment. Now, that said, depending on the nature of the organization and the information it retains, just about anything could be considered sensitive. So, of course, there's always a certain degree of variance in the definition, but just about every organization would store some data that could be used in a malicious manner. Some more specific examples of data access threats include snooping, eavesdropping, and wiretapping, all of which involve someone gaining unauthorized access to information, but by using different approaches. Snooping is pretty much as it sounds, whereby a user attempts to gain access to data using just about any method available. The term is often used with respect to using some form of malware or monitoring techniques, but it really can include any method, such as simply attempting to read a sensitive email over someone else's shoulder, or watching them enter a PIN or a password. And this is a technique which is often referred to as shoulder surfing. But one way or another, it simply involves looking for information that would not normally be available to them. Eavesdropping is similar, but it generally uses more specific methods of network monitoring and other data capture methods to intercept sensitive information. For example, malware implanted on a user's laptop could turn on their microphone or webcam while they're in a sensitive meeting. Or the malicious user could place a hidden microphone in a meeting room while it's not in use. And wiretapping draws its name from the days of what is known as POTS, or the plain old telephone system, whereby an attacker would physically tap into the wires carrying signals so that they could listen in on conversations. Most organizations these days have moved to voice over IP systems, but they have vulnerabilities as well that may still allow methods of tapping into the signals that are traveling the wires if not properly secured. Another very common and successful method of attack is through social engineering, whereby the attacker simply poses as an authorized entity and literally tricks the user into revealing sensitive information. For example, a malicious user might call someone within an organization claiming to be from the IT department, and they might inform the user that there has been a breach of their account or some other type of suspicious activity, and they need them to provide their password to prove their identity. Or they might similarly send out emails requesting users to provide other types of information, such as account numbers, to also prove that they are the legitimate entity. These types of attacks are referred to as phishing, spelled with a PH, but the process is essentially the same, simply baiting the users into revealing personal information. And dumpster diving is a technique that involves quite literally going through the trash in search of information that might have been carelessly discarded. For example, old credit card statements that are just placed into a recycle bin or a trash can without being shredded can easily be retrieved by dumpster diving. So then, in terms of mitigating these and other threats, you should begin by classifying your data, which involves asking questions such as if any laws protect that data, which users within your organization should have access, if there are any exceptions, what the ramifications are if that data is accessed in an unauthorized manner, and what its value might be to someone who should not be able to access it. The answers can help you to identify which data needs to be protected and which measures might be most effective. And those measures typically include encryption, which scrambles the data, rendering it useless to anyone who does not hold the proper encryption and decryption keys. Physical security, such as restrictions including locks and security cameras to ensure that only authorized users can access server rooms or filing cabinets. Access management methods, such as file and folder permissions. Proper data destruction methods, such as paper shredding and hard drive disposal. And of course, device management techniques that ensure that end-user devices are configured properly, updated regularly, and have adequate anti-malware applications installed to prevent them from becoming compromised, along with the ability to remotely wipe mobile devices if they're lost or stolen. Ultimately, there is no approach that can provide 100% security, but by carefully considering your data protection needs and by implementing multiple layers of security, you can ensure that your efforts are as close as possible to 100% effective. In this presentation, we'll outline some concerns and mitigation techniques with respect to data integrity, which refers to the validity of data in that it has not changed or been altered from its original form without authorization. Now, we'll look at some common considerations here, but there are several ways by which data integrity could be compromised, including some methods that don't involve any kind of malicious intent. So it's important to consider all of the ways by which sensitive information can be accessed or exchanged throughout your organization. Common ways by which data integrity can be compromised include simple human error or other unintentional mistakes, malware, of course, hardware and/or device failure, and transfer errors, including network transfers or just from one device to another, such as when copying data to a flash drive or any other type of external storage device. Some more specific data integrity attacks, however, include what's known as the man-in-the-middle attack, whereby an attacker sits between two communicating parties from a network perspective and intercepts and alters data before passing it along. For example, when sending an email, regardless of how secure your client system is, the message you send must always pass through an email server. So a compromised server could allow an attacker to gain access to every message passing through that server, enabling them to pass along misleading or otherwise altered data to the recipient. As such, email can be protected against man-in-the-middle attacks by using digital signatures, which can encrypt the message content, and they only allow access to the intended recipients of the message. Impersonation is exactly as it sounds, in that an attacker pretends to be an authorized user in order to gain access to data to alter it or use it in a fraudulent manner. Now, there are two basic types of impersonation: personal impersonation, whereby a user is pretending to be another person, and device impersonation, whereby a computer is configured to use another user's credentials in order to run a malicious service or application, or that system is also posing as a legitimate service. For example, it might be running a website that looks legitimate, but it's designed to capture personal information. Strong passwords that are difficult to guess and are regularly changed, and digital certificates are among the best ways to prevent device impersonation, but personal impersonation can't really be stopped, so user education is typically one of the most effective methods of protection. For example, ensuring that users are aware of proper policies and procedures when it comes to dealing with someone who might be asking them for sensitive information. Unauthorized information alteration is also exactly as it sounds, in that data is simply altered from its original form to benefit the attacker. For example, attempting to gain access to the payroll database to change a salary, or to alter the contents of a corporate announcement or news article. These types of alterations can occur in many forms and against many types of data, so the security measures implemented will depend on the nature of the original data itself. So there is unfortunately no single measure that can be implemented to protect against alteration, but proper file and folder permissions, encryption, auditing, and physical security can all contribute to protecting the original state of your data. Ultimately, ensuring the integrity of your data directly translates into the protection of the organization as a whole, as in many cases, data can be an organization's most valuable asset. And even when there is no malicious intent, such as human error, data integrity protection measures, such as error checking and validation methods, help to ensure that data remains consistent and accurate throughout the organization, which of course helps to ensure the success of the organization overall. In this video, we'll identify common availability concerns, along with some mitigation techniques to help ensure data availability, which in itself simply means that your data is available to be accessed one way or another whenever it's needed. The inability to access data could cause damage to the business and/or its reputation, lost revenue, or even harm to their clients or others if the data required pertains to them. So, ensuring availability is as important as protecting the data from a security perspective. In short, if information can't be accessed, then it doesn't really matter how strong your security measures are. Common methods of preventing access to information include denial of service attacks, also known as DOS attacks, which are targeted at disabling a server, a network, or even an entire site so that it simply can't provide its services normally. DOS attacks typically attempt to overload the system resources by swamping it with requests at a rate that simply can't be handled by the system, which in turn overloads its buffers and causes it to stop responding, or by running processes that take up all available memory and/or disk space. DOS attacks can usually be prevented by keeping your operating systems up to date, along with having a current anti-malware and/or antivirus application, and configuring devices such as network routers to detect potential DOS attacks by implementing packet filters and flood thresholds. Simple power outages can, of course, render data inaccessible because even a short interruption can cause servers and network devices to shut down entirely, which in itself could also result in data loss or corruption due to the improper shutdown procedures. Information such as saved files typically aren't affected by outages, but any data processing that was in progress, so to speak, could be lost, such as a file that was being edited or a database record that had been started but was never completed. Now, clearly there are many cases where we can't do anything to prevent a power outage itself, but we can implement measures such as backup power supplies or other types of emergency power to at least provide enough time to shut systems down gracefully so that any work in progress can be saved before all power is lost. Hardware failure can, of course, cause disruptions to any service and render data inaccessible. And hardware failures can sometimes be difficult to run down because there can be many culprits when it comes to failure. Just about anything between you and the data could fail at any time, again leading to downtime and possible lost data. Much like power failures, there might not be much that we can do to prevent the failure itself, but we can implement measures to ensure that we can respond to the failure appropriately, including having redundant components that can provide fault tolerance so that if, for example, a database server were to fail, there is another server with a replicated copy of the same database that can assume the services of the failed server. And of course, backup copies of any important data stored separately so that if the primary copy is unavailable, the backup copy can still be accessed. And of course, perhaps the ultimate way of preventing access to data is to destroy the physical storage device itself, such as by smashing the hard disk platters or destroying the memory chips of a solid-state drive or a flash drive, or through software means such as unconditionally formatting a hard drive in conjunction with repeated overwrites of all existing data. And I mention this because it's beneficial to know that simply deleting a file or even formatting a hard drive does not actually remove the data from the storage device at a physical level. Even a formatted hard drive can have its data recovered with the appropriate recovery software. But if the data is overwritten effectively enough, then the original data will be lost. Again, measures such as separately stored backups with only authorized access to those backups can help to ensure that important information is not permanently lost. So when it comes to protecting data, be sure to pay as much attention to ensuring its availability as you do to its security, because as mentioned, secure data must also be available for it to be of any use to anyone. In this presentation, we'll outline the purpose of antivirus and anti-malware applications, some of their distinguishing characteristics, and best practices for their use. But to begin, some of the main distinctions right off the bat include the terminology and the characteristics of each type of malware. And in fact, the terms malware and virus really just differ in how specifically they refer to programs that are designed to cause harm or damage to target systems. Malware is perhaps the most generic term and really can encompass just about any type of harmful application, although I have found that in some cases its use has been more targeted towards programs or services that are more annoying than damaging, such as spam email, adware, or spyware. But ultimately, anything that has been designed with the intent to invade your privacy, cause harm or damage, or attempt to block access could be considered as malware. Viruses, however, tend to be much more specific in their intent, in that they're designed to invade an application or any kind of executable file for the purpose of hijacking the executable code in order to perform its intended task, which can include replicating itself, gathering data to be sent back to the attacker, launching denial of service attacks, and many other malicious activities. But one of the key characteristics of a virus is that it does need a host executable file to be able to function, whereas fileless malware, as is indicated by its name, does not need a host file. Instead, it will alter the functionality of existing operating system files, which themselves are entirely legitimate from the perspective of any kind of antivirus or anti-malware application, making them very difficult to detect. But they typically rely on a user downloading an initial file, which subsequently makes the alterations. So in many cases, anti-malware or antivirus applications will recognize the downloaded files as a threat, so they can be blocked. Worms differ from viruses in that they also do not need a host file. They basically include their own executable code, but they still have to find their way into a target system, which is usually done by attaching the worm in an email, making it seem like a legitimate attachment, or by implanting it on a portable device such as a flash drive. Trojans draw their name from the mythical Trojan horse, since they are presented as legitimate files, but they carry a payload of malicious code. But like fileless malware, the Trojan itself must be opened at least once to deliver that payload. Other types of malware include keyloggers, which can record the keystrokes entered by users, which can then be used to capture passwords and other personal information such as credit card numbers. Ransomware, which encrypts data by the attacker, rendering it inaccessible until a ransom is paid. Spyware, which is designed to monitor activity and gather personal information, including PINs or passwords, as users perform their daily activities. The spyware can then send that data back to the malicious user. And adware is used to determine which ads are most effective to any given user, which in itself isn't particularly malicious, but adware does raise concerns over privacy, as data such as browsing behaviors, social media friends, travel and purchasing habits, and many other factors can be used to create a profile of a user that is all potentially gathered and used without the user's consent. So then, as potential targets of malware invasion and intrusion, we can install antivirus and or anti-malware applications that are designed to prevent these threats from entering our devices in the first place. Or if they do find their way onto a device, they can hopefully be detected and removed. And I do say hopefully here intentionally, because very much like data security methods, no antivirus or anti-malware application is ever 100% effective. But they are very good at detecting known threats. But the problem is that a brand new threat that is being developed literally right now, by definition, cannot be known until it's encountered at least once. So there is always a chance that a new threat could entirely evade detection. And coming back to the distinction between viruses and malware, back in the days when the internet was not nearly as prevalent as it is today, viruses were perhaps the primary type of threat, so the term antivirus quite literally referred to the application's ability to detect and remove viruses only. But the proliferation of the internet and its enhanced functionality is really what drove the development of new types of threats, including phishing scams that attempt to fool users into divulging personal information, spam emails that might also attempt to fool users into clicking malicious links, and websites that are designed to mimic legitimate sites so that users will enter their login credentials believing that they're on the real site. So it was really these other forms of attack that led to the term malware, which again encompasses any and all types of malicious applications and/or activities. So most security applications these days can likewise detect all known forms of malware, providing much more comprehensive protection than just detecting viruses. As for the methods of detection, they largely depend on what's known as signature detection, whereby any threat that has been detected before is reported back to the anti-malware developers, and its basic set of components and behaviors are assigned a digital signature, which can also be used to detect other forms of that malware that haven't yet been encountered because even though it might be new, it likely uses many of the same methods, so new forms can also be flagged by existing signatures. Behavior analysis is a newer approach that is often driven by machine learning, whereby signature detection is not required. Rather, it simply observes the behavior of various services and applications and quite literally learns which ones are legitimate. Anything that seems to be outside of the scope of legitimate services can then be flagged as suspicious and dealt with more rigorously. And sandboxing is a technique whereby any suspicious or questionable code will actually be allowed to execute to determine its intent, but it will be executed in a virtual environment that is entirely isolated from the rest of the operating system, so that it would not have any access to any critical components or files. If the code is determined to be malicious in the sandbox, the virtual environment is simply terminated and the code or file is deleted. As for the primary types of antivirus and anti-malware applications, they include those that are built into the operating system. In fact, if you're watching this video on a device running Windows 10 or 11, then you're already using a built-in application known as Windows Defender. There are also commercial products made by various vendors. Common examples include Norton, which is a division of Symantec, which itself was recently acquired by Broadcom, McAfee and Trend Micro, among many others, and there are also many free products available that do a very good job at protecting your system, but they generally wouldn't include any advanced features or the ability to deploy them across many systems in your organization and manage their settings centrally. Some examples include Avast, AVG, and Kaspersky. As for best practices, first and foremost, you should simply ensure that your systems have an anti-malware application installed and that it has real-time protection enabled, which actively monitors your system so that malware can be detected as soon as it arrives, as opposed to only during scans. But as mentioned, some threats are very new, so real-time protection might not catch them, so regularly scheduled scans should also be run. This way, if a new threat is registered somewhere else, even if it found its way onto your system, a scan that is run several days later might now detect it because its signature is now known. Perhaps the most important consideration is to ensure that the malware definitions are being updated regularly, which should be configured to occur automatically, but again, if a new threat does get onto your system, it may attempt to disable the update service in order to shield itself from detection. And in many cases, the scheduled scans that are configured might only be what's known as quick scans, whereby only critical system files are scanned. So you should also run periodic full scans, in which case every file is examined. Now, these clearly take much longer to complete, but they're also more thorough. Now, all of that said, I do want to finish up by saying that while many of these threats can be quite serious, the anti-malware applications of today are very good at what they do, And at least for home computing, as long as you do have an up-to-date anti-malware application running, your system should remain safe, and you can feel safe using your systems for just about any activity, including online purchases and other secure transactions over the internet. But it's always a good idea to remain vigilant, and perhaps most notably, don't ever assume that something that seems questionable is legitimate. If you suspect anything, do a little online research or seek the advice of the help desk before you install any application or click on any link. In many cases, user education and awareness can be the most effective anti-malware tool. In this video, we'll outline the importance of password security, which of course is used as perhaps the most common means of establishing our identity when secure access is required. Now, of course, we're all familiar with using passwords, but with respect to the components and/or the terminology, when we're presented with any kind of login screen, such as a website or as part of an application, that component is known as the verifier because it will ultimately verify the value that we supply. And we as users are known as claimants because we are claiming to be a particular person or entity. The value that we provide as the password is then compared to what is stored, and if the values match, of course, we're granted access, and if they don't, we're denied access. Now, perhaps it goes without saying that passwords need to be kept secure because they provide us with the ability to protect our assets, including private or sensitive personal information, account numbers and other financial assets, and of course, your overall identity. If your username and password for any given service are obtained by an unauthorized entity, there is no way for the verifier to distinguish between you and the unauthorized user. So they would be able to perform any task that you would normally be able to do because as far as the verifier is concerned, the correct information was supplied. So that unauthorized user might as well be you. Now, some basic considerations with respect to passwords include simply requiring that they be used. Now, this will depend on the circumstances, but there are many devices and services that support the use of passwords, but don't require them. For example, a local computer at home often does not require you to create a password, nor do many mobile devices, which means that anyone else who might happen upon those devices could access anything on them. That might be a little more acceptable for something like a desktop computer at home, where access is much more controlled, but mobile devices are far more susceptible to being lost or stolen, so they should always have passwords or PINs enabled. In addition, many devices have default passwords assigned for when they're configured for the first time, so it might be easy to simply leave that password in place. But in many cases, the password is the same for all devices of the same make and model. For example, home Wi-Fi routers might come with a default password of something like admin. So if you don't change it, if let's say your neighbor is able to pick up on that signal and they're somewhat technically savvy, they might try to log into that router with that password and successfully gain access, which would then allow them to reconfigure it however they like. So while those default passwords are certainly useful for initial configuration, part of that configuration should always include changing the default password to something else. However, while passwords are still perhaps the most commonly used form of securing our identities, they aren't without their problems. Most notably, the use of passwords that are too simple and/or too easy to guess, which stems from another problem in that we often have too many to remember. So each of those factors tend to play off one another, so to speak, in that having so many passwords virtually encourages the use of fewer passwords. And if they're very complex, then they're also very difficult for us to remember. So many people will tend to use simpler passwords and reuse the same password for many different services, meaning that if that password becomes compromised, then the attacker can gain access to every service where that particular password is used. In addition, because of these vulnerabilities, passwords are perhaps the most common target of attacks, and in many cases those attacks don't need to be overly sophisticated. One of the most common methods by which passwords can be obtained is through simple social engineering attacks, whereby the malicious user simply poses as a legitimate entity and fools the user into revealing their password. Toward that end, there are utilities, services, and methods available to assist with password protection, including password managers, which are applications designed to store passwords in encrypted format to keep them secure and to autofill them into various applications when required, so that we can use more complex passwords without having to remember them every time. Most modern web browsers have password managers built in to make accessing secure sites and services easier. However, this does introduce a problem in that if you're attempting to access any given service from a different computer other than your own, and you don't remember the password, then you might not be able to access that service at all. Although some password managers store passwords in the cloud. So as long as you can sign into that cloud service, you might still have access to all other passwords. Many devices, applications, and services also support many characters, which provides the ability to use passphrases instead of passwords. In short, the more characters you use, the harder it is for someone to guess, or for a password cracking tool to determine what the passphrase is. Lastly, devices such as smartphones and tablets also include pins or facial recognition for access to the device itself. So not only do you need to provide passwords for the services you use, but the device itself is now also protected by these additional forms of security. So even if the device is lost or stolen, the entire interface is blocked without the correct PIN and/or facial recognition, which provides for multi-factor authentication, or MFA, whereby at least two forms of authentication must be provided to gain access. Ultimately, it's likely that passwords will persist for quite some time, and by following these and other best practices, they can be kept secure, but you should always remain vigilant when it comes to using passwords to ensure that they aren't easily guessed and/or reused too often. In this presentation, we'll outline best practices for browsing the internet safely, which I will certainly say that these days has become much easier due in large part to the built-in protection features of modern browsers and devices. Back about 15 or 20 years ago, there certainly still were security features that could be configured in browsers, but they have greatly improved over the years and they're very good at detecting sites and content that could be malicious. But in some browsers, these features must be enabled, or to put that another way, it's possible that they may have been disabled, so it never hurts to check their status. For example, in Google Chrome, under Settings, Advanced, Privacy and Security, there is an option to protect you and your device from dangerous websites. In Mozilla Firefox, under Preferences, Privacy and Security, you can enable Block Dangerous and Deceptive Content. And other browsers such as Microsoft Edge and Apple's Safari have similar settings. In addition, almost every modern browser has an option to browse in some kind of private or dark mode, so to speak, whereby browsing activity and personal information that is usually stored for the benefit of future sessions is either not retained in the first place or it's automatically cleared when you close the browser, which can be very useful for mobile devices that are much more susceptible to being lost or stolen, or if you're using a public and/or a shared device. But as is so often the case when it comes to anything related to security, nothing is 100% effective. So another component of safe browsing is simply being aware of the risks. For example, not clicking on unknown links, particularly those that are included in emails from unknown senders, or those that claim to take you to your banking or other financial services site. Anything presented to you in that manner is almost always fraudulent, and they're only attempting to fool you into revealing your login credentials. And with respect to unknown links or sites, the same would apply to services such as online purchases. In other words, be sure to only use well-known and reputable online merchants when providing credit card or other payment information, and also make sure that there is a digital certificate for the site, which can usually be identified by the presence of a padlock icon in the address bar. Clicking on that padlock will show you the security information and allow you to confirm that the certificate for that site was issued to the legitimate entity. Another common technique of attempting to fool users into clicking an untrustworthy link is by using what's known as a pop-up, whereby a dialog box simply appears during your online session or after arriving at a particular site, which then informs you that your system has become infected or that you need an additional feature to be installed to be able to view the site correctly. Again, these are almost always attempts to get you to install something malicious onto your system, and they should just be dismissed. These days, most modern browsers include all the necessary components to view sites correctly to begin with, and while client-side scripting is often a feature that you do want enabled on your system to allow for enhanced functionality of legitimate sites, it can also allow for an unwanted script to be run. So it can at least be temporarily disabled if necessary to provide higher security. Not every site or service may offer it, but if they do, use multi-factor authentication when signing in. This enhances the security of your login by requiring at least one extra method of establishing your identity over and above your username and password. A very common example is to receive a code via email or text message after you've entered your standard username and password. This ensures that even if someone else did obtain your credentials, they would still be prevented from signing in without also receiving the code. Many online services these days will offer multi-factor authentication, and some will in fact require it. But from a security perspective, it greatly enhances the security of the sign-in process. And similar to client-side scripting, cookies and cached information can help to improve your browsing experiences because cached data can store information that can be reused to allow sites to load more quickly when revisited, and cookies can retain site settings and preferences, including login credentials, so that you don't have to type them in each time. Now, while these are both convenient features, if your device has been lost or stolen, any data that has been cached and any cookies present could be accessed and personal information could then be revealed. So it's not a bad idea to clear cookies and caches, particularly for mobile devices or for any kind of shared device. And for situations where you do have a mobile device, avoid using any kind of unsecured public Wi-Fi network such as those in restaurants or coffee shops. But if you're particularly mobile and you do most of your work on public networks, then you can still increase the security of your browsing by using a virtual private network or VPN service. Your workplace environment might provide one for you, but if you don't have one available otherwise, there are cloud-based services to which anyone can subscribe. The VPN establishes a secured connection between your device and the VPN provider first. Then all traffic is routed through the provider so that intruders can't capture any information from your browsing session. But coming back to the unsecured Wi-Fi connection, even if you do have a VPN, the data being sent from your device must first travel from that device to the Wi-Fi access point, which of course occurs before any traffic reaches the VPN. So if there is a malicious user connected to the same unsecured network, then they could still capture data as it travels between you and the access point. So again, try to use secured Wi-Fi connections whenever possible. Finally, you should always ensure that your device and its browser are being updated regularly. And it's also helpful to use bookmarks for often accessed sites, as they link you directly to the same site every time, and avoid any typos when entering the URL. It's not uncommon for malicious sites to register a URL that is very similar to that of the legitimate URL in hopes that a typo will bring users to the malicious site instead. Again, web browsing is certainly much safer than it used to be, given the more advanced security features of devices and their browsers, and users have also become much more savvy as more and more fraudulent methods become exposed. But by observing these and other best practices, you can help to ensure that your browsing activities remain as secure as possible. In this video, we'll examine the importance of patches and updates which can be applied to your device's operating system, the drivers that are installed, and of course the applications you're running. Updates and patches are released by the vendors themselves, and they're typically released on a somewhat scheduled basis, although in the case of security updates in particular, they can be released at just about any time, so it's important to remain vigilant when it comes to ensuring that updates are being applied. The primary reasons to apply updates include ensuring that your system has the highest level of functionality available, that it provides the stability you need, and perhaps most notably, to ensure the highest level of protection against threats. Now, depending on the device and/or the operating system you're running, there may be different terms in use for various types of updates. For example, on a Windows-based system, updates that enhance functionality are known as feature updates, whereas updates that enhance stability are known as quality updates. In short, this means that a feature update will introduce something new to enhance functionality, whereas a quality update is meant to correct an issue with something that exists already. Security updates, however, are fairly universal in that they're always meant to address some kind of potential vulnerability. Now, that said, the terminology might not be all that important in all cases, but there may be situations where an update indicates that it has been designed to correct an issue with a particular application or a feature of the operating system, but you simply aren't running that application, or you haven't enabled that feature, in which case the update would not be needed. Devices that do run Windows receive their updates through a service known as Windows Update. And while there are various ways by which this service can be implemented and managed, all Windows devices are set by default to have their updates downloaded and installed automatically. And as mentioned earlier, updates are usually downloaded on a fairly regular basis, but you can also check manually at any time through the Settings app. If you're in a corporate environment, then administration may have your device configured to use a service known as Windows Server Update Services, or WSUS, whereby there is a dedicated server or servers that download all updates first. Then administrators can go through the list and selectively choose which updates they want to deploy and reject any others. Then they can also control which devices will receive their updates and at which time. This allows for much greater control over the process and consistency throughout the environment. But for home computing, WSUS is not available, hence the automatic download option should generally be used. You do still have configurable options even in home computing environments to configure how updates will be downloaded and applied. For example, you can pause the update service itself if you want to ensure that nothing changes on your system. You can also configure time frames where updates should not be installed, such as during business hours, and you can uninstall updates that may be unnecessary or problematic. Systems running Linux can use the terminal and the apt-get command to check for updates, or some distributions do include a graphic user interface for managing updates. If using the command terminal, however, there are two options: apt-get update and apt-get upgrade. And there is an important distinction between an update and an upgrade. In short, an update does not increment the version of an application, but an upgrade does. In other words, let's say you have application X version 5. then an update to that app might be designed to correct a problem or even introduce a new feature, but it remains Application X version 5. An upgrade, however, would install Application X version 5.1 or possibly even version 6, depending on how significant the changes are. Updates for macOS can be obtained through the App Store, just like the apps themselves, and they also offer both updates and upgrades for the applications you're running and the operating system. However, in some cases, it might be required that you upgrade your device or app before any given update can be applied. For example, Update X might require you to be running OS version Y for it to be supported. So, in some cases, you may need to perform separate installs. And of course, patches and updates are also available for the most common mobile device platforms, such as Android and iOS. And much like their counterparts, they're available from their respective app stores or through the settings of the device itself. Some updates, however, can be lengthy to install and large in size, such as an operating system upgrade. So you might be informed that in order to install the upgrade, your device has to be plugged into a power source as opposed to just running on battery, and you might also have to be connected to a Wi-Fi network. The power requirement is to ensure that the battery does not run out during the process, and the Wi-Fi connection ensures that no data overages are charged by your carrier due to the size of the download. In short, for most of us, in most situations, it's always recommended to keep devices up to date. There are a few exceptions, such as very specific use devices where you might not want updates because it's not out of the question that an update can cause a problem, or the update might simply install something that isn't needed. So there are rare situations where the existing stability and reliability of a system is preferred over keeping it current. But overall, patches and updates are one of the best ways to ensure your device remains as functional, stable, and secure as possible. In this presentation, we'll outline several device security best practices, which are particularly important these days with the prevalence of mobile devices, but many of these considerations are applicable to desktop systems as well. So, overall device security should begin by ensuring that you have a PIN or a password configured to simply access the interface of the device itself. Again, particularly for mobile devices, which are more susceptible to being lost or stolen. Now, this would also include more advanced security options such as facial recognition or fingerprint recognition, but in short, most devices do allow you to not use any type of security feature to access its interface, which might be fine for something like a home computer in a very controlled environment, but for all other situations, the device should have a PIN or a password enabled. When you need to connect to the internet using a mobile device, whenever possible, avoid using a public Wi-Fi connection, especially if that connection is not secured with a password. If you don't need to download any significant amount of data, then it would be preferable to just use the service of your mobile provider as opposed to the public Wi-Fi network because your service provider does offer security. All devices should be configured to download and install updates automatically to ensure that your devices are as current as possible. Many updates are designed to address a recently discovered security vulnerability, so by not applying those updates, the chance of your device becoming compromised significantly increases. Whenever possible, enable and/or use multi-factor authentication features, which requires that at least two means of establishing your identity be used. The more layers of security you have enabled, the more difficult it becomes for that device to become compromised. For mobile devices, particularly those that are issued and managed by your company, ensure that they support the ability to be remotely locked and, if necessary, remotely wiped. Lock would be appropriate if you simply left a device behind, but you know exactly where it is and it can be easily retrieved, whereas a wipe might be required if the device was entirely lost or stolen, or there is simply little chance that it can be recovered. Now, these features are also supported by personal devices that aren't managed by a company. They simply require you to sign in using an account that you can create with the vendor, such as an Apple ID or a Google account. You can then associate all of your mobile devices with that account so they can either be locked or wiped if needed. They also support the ability to locate the device provided it's still powered on, so be sure these features are enabled if available. And on the topic of providers, major device vendors such as Apple, Microsoft, and Google all offer free cloud storage services which allow you to back up important data to the cloud, which then makes it available from any device, so that even if your primary device is lost, stolen, or otherwise compromised, you can at least still access your data. And if you do have sensitive data stored on something like the hard drive of a laptop, many devices also support the ability to encrypt that data so that even if the hard drive is removed and attached to another system, the data would still be inaccessible. And if you need to ensure that data is protected while in transit, especially over the internet, you can use a virtual private network or VPN provider, which establishes an encrypted session between your device and the provider first, often referred to as a tunnel. From that point, all traffic in and out of your system goes through that encrypted tunnel, ensuring that all data transfers are secured. Many devices will come with features to enhance the overall functionality, but many of us simply don't need or use every feature, so it's a good idea to simply disable features that aren't being used. While they're designed to enhance functionality, every service that runs in support of any given feature does represent a possible avenue of attack for a malicious user, particularly because many of them will want access to other features of the device. For example, you might have noticed that when you install a new app or enable a new feature, you might be prompted to allow that app or feature to gain access to something like your photos, location services, or other information that could be sensitive in nature. While in most cases those requests are legitimate and required for full functionality, for example, a GPS app would require access to your location services to function properly, a questionable app might prompt for access to components or features that it should not have. For example, a simple locally installed game should not be allowed to access your photos or your location. You should always have some kind of anti-malware and or antivirus application installed, and you should also block any unknown apps that attempt to install themselves automatically, such as when a website informs you that a particular app or service is required to support that site. In some cases, those messages might be legitimate, but most modern browsers automatically support the necessary features for any given site, so it's at least worth investigating if you're receiving such a prompt. And it's also worth mentioning that there are indeed anti-malware applications for mobile device platforms such as iOS and Android, but the reason why most mobile devices don't have them installed to begin with is because the apps that can be installed can only be obtained from the vendor's app store, which only offers apps that have been thoroughly vetted by the vendor, so they're known to be safe. And in most cases, the devices won't support the installation of anything not obtained from the App Store. But that does not preclude the fact that devices can be what's known as jailbroken, which refers to the ability to remove those restrictions and allows you to install anything. Now, while jailbreaking is legal, it can invalidate the warranty and or any support packages that came with it, and it simply leaves your device less protected, so it's generally not recommended, at least from a security perspective. Lastly, consider separating important and or business data from personal data, which may be configured automatically if your device is corporately issued and managed. But even for personal devices, you can configure separate partitions to keep data isolated. For example, on a laptop, you might choose to keep less important data on the primary C drive, but for anything that is more important, you could create a separate partition on the hard drive, which then allows you to completely wipe the operating system and reinstall it without affecting the data on the other partition. You might also just keep the important data on a separate device, such as a flash drive or an external USB hard drive, or back it up to the cloud. You should also consider the use of location services, which are required for many apps, but it does also provide location information to many other apps and services, and quite simply can be used to track your location. So there might be situations where you don't want this information to be accessible, and again, certain apps might ask for access to location services that just don't need it, so just be mindful of its use. Ultimately, there are many other ways by which you can keep your devices secure, but perhaps the best tool of all is simply user knowledge, not just with respect to the features of the device, but the way by which those features could be used against you. So, as always, vigilance and due diligence should always be included as a best practice as well. In this video, we'll provide an overview of some common best practices for implementing and maintaining software security, which refers to ensuring that questionable or unwanted software does not find its way onto our devices. Now, in that regard, the primary methods by which any software can be installed include using physical media such as CDs, DVDs, or Blu-ray discs, or flash drives or other external devices, and perhaps most commonly these days, through downloads, which, as you might imagine, are the least controllable because they're so prevalent and they can come from anywhere at any time. At least with physical media, you have to obtain the media first. So if you're looking for a specific application, let's say in a tech store, you know that you're getting something legitimate. Although there can certainly be burned copies of that software that you might obtain from other users. And the same goes for flash drives. Anyone could just give you a drive with something on it. But again, those are still more controllable than downloads, which can be obtained by anyone, anytime, from any site. So by practicing software security, your device can be protected against unauthorized access through a malicious app. It can also be protected against malicious activity, such as having a service installed that gathers sensitive data from the device and sends it back to the malicious user, and it can also help to protect the data stored locally on that device. In short, it just keeps unwanted and/or questionable applications from getting onto your system in the first place. Some specific methods of software protection include using only licensed software from reputable vendors. While there are many free apps and utilities that are useful, they simply aren't vetted and tested as thoroughly as licensed applications are. Plus, they would not include any kind of support from the vendor. Limiting access refers to only allowing technical support staff or network administrators to install software in the first place, although this would only be applicable in a workplace environment, not so much for home users. But even at home, you can still ensure that only some accounts have administrative privileges. For example, if you have children using your home computer, they can use standard user accounts, which do not allow software installations. Most devices also have options in their settings that can specify acceptable locations from which software can be installed. For example, you can specify that only the App Store of the associated platform be used for obtaining software. And of course, you should always ensure that the applications that are installed are configured to receive patches and updates automatically. Many device platforms have separate configurable options for updating the device itself versus updating the apps that are installed, although most apps that are obtained from legitimate sources will be configured to apply updates automatically, but it's always worth checking the configuration. All of that said, there are some considerations when it comes to implementing software security best practices, including an increase in the overall cost of software. As mentioned, there are many free applications available, but in short, security simply doesn't come free. So, in larger corporate environments especially, requiring software security can have a tremendous impact on the cost of obtaining and managing software, particularly if you need to distribute that application to thousands of devices. Software security practices can also delay the release and/or the distribution of software, But again, this is part of the price, so to speak. In order to ensure that all security practices are observed, it can simply take more time. And security practices also require ongoing updates and maintenance, not just with respect to the applications themselves, but also the policies and procedures in use in your organization. Things evolve and develop very rapidly in the world of information technology, so policies and procedures can become outdated just as rapidly as technology does. Ultimately, while there may be some downsides to increasing security, they almost never outweigh the benefits, so regardless of the circumstances, it's never a bad idea to observe and adhere to software security best practices. So in this course, we've examined basic concepts surrounding the CIA Triad and information security. We did this by exploring the principle of least privilege, common confidentiality, integrity, and availability concerns, antivirus and anti-malware software, firewalls and password security, safe browsing, the importance of patching and updating, and device security best practices, and best practices for maintaining software security, validating download sources, mobile device security, and removing unwanted software. In our next course, we'll move on to explore basic concepts surrounding privacy and encryption.